Welcome to one of the hallmark events of a year of forward thinking, Forward Fest. My name is Morgan Smith, a proud member of the great Princeton class of 2021. While I had the good fortune to be on campus this past spring to round out my time as a student, we were sad to not be able to invite people to gather in person to exchange ideas and stories. Luckily, through our online Forward Fest series, we've still been able to connect through programming that introduce bold ideas and forward thinking that make Princeton the special place that it is. In this final installment of the series, we will revisit some of this year's topics in light of a changed world and address them anew in concert with other themes. To help me with this today, I will be joined by four of Princeton's forward thinkers: Allison Carruth, Professor of American Studies in the Meadows Environmental Institute; Céline Gounder, MD, Internist, Infectious Disease Specialist, Epidemiologist, and member of the class of 1997; Gregory, Professor of Religion and the Chair of the Humanities Council; and last but not least, Lawrence Ralph, Professor of Anthropology and the co-director of the Center on Transnational Policing. When Forward Fest was launched in October of 2020, we started with a theme that reflected a reality and a trajectory none of us could have quite imagined a year ago: public health. Let's take a quick look at the first conversation so that we can see how far we've come.
I think that's very important to remember that silver bullet's not going to be the answer here. It's going to be many approaches that are going to help get us out of this, but a more nimble and responsive regulatory apparatus would certainly help, because I think we have the technology for many of these things.
And Anne and Angus, I mean, it seems to me that the socioeconomic kind of research is probably the hardest to put on fast forward. Is there anything that can be done more quickly and perhaps inform policies, for example, like the CARES Act, that kind of relief bill?
Well, I mean, yes and no. It's really complicated. I think the CDC, which is under enormous pressure, has done a relatively good job. But in the long run, we have a public health system that's not set up to deliver fast results, because, you know, the deaths are collected by the states, the National Vital Statistics system is collected by the states, and coroners pass them on to the states, and then the states send them to the CDC. If you were designing a system to work in a pandemic, you wouldn't do it that way because it takes too long.
I'm now joined by Céline Gounder, an infectious disease specialist, immunologist, and medical journalist from the class of 1997, who moderated that discussion and just days later was named to then President-elect Biden's coronavirus task force. Dr. Gounder, welcome to Forward Fest.
It's great to be here.
Dr. Gounder, it must seem like a lifetime ago to see that clip and your colleagues from the worlds of biology, health policy, and economics having so much uncertainty about what was to come. Can you talk to us about where we were and how far we've come in terms of the US response to coronavirus from your seat?
I think some of the lessons of the past year include how important it is not to politicize a pandemic and to turn against one another. I think it's really important to focus on the science, lead by the science, but at the same time to recognize that there are economic and political consequences to something like this. I think, unfortunately, this was very much turned into public health and science versus the economy. And if you look at the countries that really did implement public health measures, even before we had vaccines, the public measures that we had on hand, so things like masking, improving ventilation and the like, those are the countries that have been economically most insulated from the fallout of the pandemic. And so these things really do go hand in hand. Now, that also means recognizing who's most vulnerable in terms of economic impact and doing something to help them. So I think some of the folks who have suffered the most over the course of the pandemic are small business owners, many of whom were, for example, restaurant or bar owners, gym owners, maybe hair salon, barbershops, those kinds of places where the work they do very much involves being in close quarters with their customers, close together. And many of these are small businesses that have more difficulty weathering long periods of shutdown, social distancing and the like. And so I think recognizing those vulnerabilities and helping small businesses like that to be able to still pay rent, make payroll, even if they're not able to stay open during that period. I think those are the kinds of things we needed to really have more foresight about. We didn't. We eventually did start to provide some of those supports under the new administration, and I think that's been really important.
In that description, you are shining a light on the interdisciplinary Princeton education, preparing graduates who have a focus on science and yet understand the real-world human implications of social science and policy and communication. How would you describe the skill set you've had to use in the last year?
Yeah, I think this transition really started much earlier. And in fact, I would say the seed for all of what I do now was really planted in the very first job I had out of Princeton. I spent the year working with Ralph Nader, who was class of 1955, doing tuberculosis advocacy in Washington, D.C. And so Ralph at the time had taken an interest in, why is it there's all of this advocacy around HIV? So this is in the 90s. Why is there all this advocacy around HIV, but not around tuberculosis and malaria, which remain the other two big infectious disease killers. And now you can add COVID to the list, but big infectious disease killers around the world. And, a lot of this has to do with who is impacted. And so in the United States, you did have educated gay men, powerful gay men who were suffering from HIV, who mobilized to really advocate for funding, for research, for rights. And you did not have a similar constituency around tuberculosis and malaria. Those diseases, by and large, affect, in this country, tuberculosis affects communities of color, by and large, many of whom are immigrants. Around the world, TB and malaria, as well as HIV, are very much diseases of the global South. And so you just don't have that money and power to back the advocacy. And so after that year, learning how to be an advocate, how bills make their way through Congress, how different programs get funded, meeting with everybody from David Satcher, who was Surgeon General at the time, and Donna Shalala, who was head of Health and Human Services, down to people who were affected patients or advocates in developing countries. Sort of put that on the back burner, went to medical school and public health school, residency, fellowship, the usual sort of medical training path. But at the same time, over those years, would keep getting asked to help with various different things. Anything from, when I'd be working in Soweto in South Africa, hey, can you help lead a town hall with patients and families and local journalists and advocates to answer questions and help people understand, why it's so important to get tested for HIV and to be on treatment. It might have been anything from that to, hey, we want to have this congressional briefing, or could you meet with the legislative aide or director for Congressman or Senator so-and-so to explain why it's so important that we have funding for research and public health programs for these infectious diseases. And so I kept getting pulled into stuff like that over the years. And my last position at Johns Hopkins, this was after I completed my training. I stayed on for a couple more years on faculty. And that last position was also very much focused on the translation of science into policy and impact. And in that case, it was how do you take some of the research the group I had been working with had been doing on preventing tuberculosis among HIV infected people. How do you now take that research and actually have that impact? And so that meant coordinating with ministries of health, developing guidelines. And then once you have guidelines, you need to have protocols for how do you implement that at a more micro level. It means meeting with folks in clinics, hospitals. How do you train people? How do you get support from patients and advocacy groups? And how do you get local journalists on board to cover this? So that was very much, the work I was doing at that time. And what I would say the through line throughout my career, in a sense, was this idea of how do you translate science for the lay public to have impact. And, there are many different ways in which you can do that. Journalism is certainly one. And I then later more fully pivoted towards journalism in about 2013, right before the Ebola epidemic. And then Ebola hit and really got pulled into a lot of television coverage and writing around Ebola. And so, this is not my first rodeo, so to speak. But I think I've been sort of building up to this, and it's funny because I never set out to be a medical journalist per se. It was more a question of seeing a disconnect between the research I was seeing in the academic setting and that not translating to impact on the ground.
Right, and you've definitely been a translator this year, but from what you're telling me, it seems like you've been doing that for decades, and something new is always coming up and catching us unaware. What are we learning from this moment that might help us to break some of those patterns?
Yeah, I think in some ways this moment is almost traumatizing to me because I've seen the forgetting happen before. With HIV, once it moved to being a disease of poor people of color in this country and a disease of the global South around the world, people in this country are sort of like, wait, what, HIV is really still a problem? They think it's been relegated to the history books, and definitely think tuberculosis has been relegated to the history books. After Ebola, and it wasn't even that Ebola was over. It took 2 years after it really dropped out of the news here in the United States for the Ebola epidemic in West Africa to really draw to a close. But once all the Americans who had been infected doing aid work, once all of them had been discharged from the hospital, once our 2014 midterm elections were over, it really did drop out of the news. And I think part of it is we were not directly impacted anymore. And secondly, so much of what gets covered is driven by what can you use as a political wedge issue. And I think so long as Ebola was that, and if you think back in time, there was all this conversation about, should we close our borders? Should we, quarantine people? And how do you quarantine them? And so once it was no longer something that you could use as a political wedge issue in the media, people really lost interest. And similarly, I'm seeing the exact same thing happening now with COVID, which is, we're turning a corner, mission accomplished, we're done, we're returning back to normal life, not a problem anymore. And the sad reality is, if you look at transmission rates in this country among people who have not yet been vaccinated, and remember at the time that we're speaking right now, we have hit basically just over half of adult Americans, just over half have been fully vaccinated. So that means, about half of American adults have not been fully vaccinated yet, not to mention children not having had the opportunity yet. And what we're seeing is that transmission rates among unvaccinated persons in this country are just as high as they were back in January at the peak. And so we have, in a sense, two different COVID pandemics. The COVID pandemics for the privileged, who had the privilege of getting vaccinated and moving on with their lives and celebrating, and really being able to reclaim their lives, which I think is wonderful. But at the same time, I think all too many of us who are in that category, and I am one of them, who has that privilege, all too many of us are moving on, forgetting the people who have not had that privilege, in some cases blaming them for not having that privilege, and really acting as if things are normal. And the reality is that it is not normal here in the US still, and certainly will not be around the world. Some of the current projections are that it could take, at the current rate we're going, if things don't change, in some countries in parts of Asia, Africa, Latin America, it could take over a decade to vaccinate populations fully against COVID. And so we really do have a lot of work to do. And that means continuing to pay attention to this as a very real and present issue for all of us.
And that certainly speaks to my final question, but perhaps there's more. Dr. Gounder, what keeps you up at night?
Morgan, what keeps me up at night is I'm afraid we're going to forget. I'm afraid we're going to put this behind us and not do the work we need to be doing to get everyone around the world vaccinated. You know, it's really painful for me actually when people say, oh, we're rounding the corner, we can move on with our lives. Well, I just lost a third relative to COVID in India. We have relatives right now hospitalized with COVID in India. I can tell you, we have not rounded the corner. This is very real for me, that this is still happening. You know, and if you look at what's happening in Latin America, just south of us, this is very real. People are still dying. And so I really do worry that we are a very young nation. We, I think, have difficulty sometimes remembering our own history, even the recent past. And that forgetting really concerns me. And it also concerns me that I'm not sure that we are going to learn the lessons we should have learned from this experience. We certainly did not. After HIV, after Ebola, there were lessons to be learned from those experiences. The need to invest in public health and build up public health preparedness, just in the way that we invest in biomedical research. If you look at the budgets of NIH versus CDC, CDC is like the tiny step brother or sister to the NIH in terms of the size of their budgets and how clearly we as a country value one kind of health endeavor versus another. And I think, I really hope that we understand that investing in public health workforce, investing in the information technology, the tech to power public health. You know, we saw how our vaccine scheduling appointment systems crashed because they were so unprepared to deal with that. And that's really the result of underinvestment in public health information systems over decades. We need more investment in public health laboratory capacity. Things like when we talk about genomic surveillance to be tracking these new emerging variants. These are all the things that we need to be investing in. And yet what's happened over and over again is we surge funding, surge people when there's a crisis, and then we pull back on all of that immediately after. And so I hope that we continue to invest in this space, to build up this space. And it's not just about people's health. It's frankly also about protecting our economy and a real investment in national security. So that would be my hope. But that is also what keeps me up at night.
Well, it'll take a lot of forward thinking to see where we are, where we need to go, and then to have the understanding of science and civic mindedness to help us get it done. Dr. Gounder, thank you so much for your service and giving us your insights today.
My pleasure.
After a short break, we will be back to talk about another issue discussed in an earlier Forward Fest, social justice and policing in the US. Soon after COVID-19 gripped our attention, the nation was also forced to face another epidemic: Black lives taken in violence at the hands of law enforcement. An early Forward Fest focused on these issues. Let's take a look at that conversation, again from last October.
What kinds of interventions can we carry out right now that are going to potentially reduce the surge of violence that's going on? And then if we want to think seriously about how do we create stronger communities, how do we create places where we don't see such severe inequality across communities that generates, or that at least makes communities vulnerable to violence, then we do need to think about long-term solutions and long-term investments and just a shift in approach. And it's not, I mean, it is the root causes, but it's really just what are the basic investments that should be made in every community across the country to make sure it's a safe, thriving, prosperous community. These types of investments are taken for granted in most communities. And I think a lot of people studying this issue are just arguing that those basic investments should be extended to every community across the country.
Yeah, if I could just piggyback on that. I mean, and I think that even in the short term, it's essential to know the difference between evidence-based difference between the root causes and what's happened in the immediate context. So even as Patrick is saying that, like in the short time, we might be able to address the spike in violence by investing in a job program or something like that. That's because we know that violence, spikes when people are unemployed, right? But if we, for instance, thought that violence was spiking because too many police officers got COVID and they weren't able to do their regular patrols, then the short-term solution would be to, hire more police or something like that, right? And so we have to know the difference between what actually causes violence, and so we have a spike, but it's a predictable spike in the context of a pandemic. People are losing their jobs, they're losing their homes. We would expect alcoholism to rise and drug abuse to rise. We would expect mental health issues to rise, right? And we would expect a corresponding rise in violence and crime because of that. And so, but we have to know that those are the things that motivate crime and not just the culture or behavioral attitudes of certain groups. And I think that's an issue.
With me now is Professor of Anthropology, Lawrence Ralph, who was part of that conversation in the fall. Professor Ralph, welcome.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So Professor Ralph, could I take you back to that conversation that you had with your colleagues in October? You said it was heartening that our lexicon was beginning to change and that we were talking about re-envisioning policing as community health or community engagement. You also said that with this change in the public discourse, it is a moment to seize. That was 6 months ago. Have we seized it?
Well, I think that we still have the momentum in terms of seizing the moment. I think it's an ongoing process in terms of staying vigilant about social issues, particularly policing, and making sure we're moving forward in a way that's not enhancing police presence, but also addressing some of the issues that have to do with police violence and extrajudicial police force. And so I think, I think we're still in the midst of the conversation. I don't think that we've faced a really significant backlash, which is also important to note. And I think some important things have happened, like the verdict in the Derek Chauvin case. And now we can just say definitively that it was a murder, and I think that's important to note, and that the police officer was found guilty. I think that was a crucial moment because it could have, we very much could have had riots or uprisings, and a lot of cities had the verdict been gone the other way. And so I think, there's something to be said for the fact that we went through the process, had a trial, and that police officer was held accountable.
In October, you said that while you were surprised that this really became a part of the general public discourse, you weren't surprised that it happened during the pandemic. We had what you called, and I really like the way you described it, a shared sense of endangerment. And it put us all in a shared mindset of needing to look out for one another and knowing that we were all vulnerable. Now that we're starting to hear more talk of coming out of the pandemic and some of the previous restrictions and fears lessening, are you seeing that idea of a shared mindset shifting? Should we worry about not feeling that solidarity anymore? And what's the implication for social justice issues?
Yeah, I think there's a danger of forgetting and thinking that we can return to a normal that existed before the pandemic. I think part of the normal that existed before the pandemic was the ability to be distracted and the ability to not have to consider certain things because that's not a part of your everyday reality. And I think there is a danger of going back to that. I think it's too early to tell now, but I think, you know, a lot of people have went through a lot of things during this pandemic. I mean, just speaking of my own family and speaking of my students and what they've gone through, the losses, the just wrestling with mental health issues, you know, reconfiguring family, you know, having a different perspective on, you know, what's valuable in life. And I think we need to carry on those lessons, good or bad, into the future and kind of think about our society in terms of the lessons that we've learned. I think the danger is that we let ourselves be distracted by the society opening up in a way that you know, we forget the recent past, and these things, you know, can reemerge very easily. You know, and I say that for the pandemic, and I say that for police violence. I say that for the major issues of our day. So I think we have to use this as a way to kind of fundamentally think about what's valuable to us as individuals and also as a society.
You are also one of the co-founders with Professor Aisha Beliso de Jesus of the Center on Transnational Policing. I'm wondering if this period of the last few months has changed the focus of the research that's coming out of that center. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, it's changed the focus because we, you know, kind of we were in the midst of doing some research projects that were kind of on the ground research projects. For example, we were going to the Olympics to study security and kind of infrastructure in the Olympics, and we're unable to do that because of the pandemic. And even now, there is the Olympics, but they're not allowing visitors in the same way, so we're not able to do that. So what we've done is kind of shift gears from a lot of the research on the ground research projects we had going on to more a public facing center and speaking about the issues of the day and really convening conversations and just trying to build alliances so that we can think through these issues more collaboratively in the future.
And in your own work, have you used this time to pivot to the next big idea or double down on some of the forward-thinking work or media that you've been pioneering?
Yeah, well, I've been working a lot on visual media during the pandemic. I think it's been in part because I haven't been able to do some of the research projects that I was engaged in, and also in part because of I just happened to be wrapping up some writing projects. And so I've been working on kind of visual mediums. And I think, you know, part of it is that, you know, we're vying for attention as scholars now too, you know, and I think that sense really got heightened in the pandemic, and the notion that, you know, people's attention are pulled in various ways, and we can't necessarily rely on the same playbook that we've relied on in the past to convey information. We have to be able to think differently and kind of meet people out where different messages. And so I had an animated film that I've been talking about a lot during the pandemic. And I've also been working on a graphic novel during the pandemic. And so I'm trying to kind of figure out new ways to reach new audiences with some of the material that I've been working on.
These are certainly ways to think forward new ideas. But when you hear the term forward thinking, what comes to you, particularly within your area of concentration?
Well, I think the key about forward thinking is always to be reimagining, you know, and I think that we're in a moment where it's really critical to question, you know, our normal routines, our sense of, what we take for granted. And I think the way to really be critical of that is to have forward thinking and to be reimagining kind of the world as we want it to be. I think oftentimes we get complacent and blocked in our political discourses about just the pragmatics of what we think can actually happen, rather than, taking bold steps to create the world we want. And we don't want to wait until, we're faced with a crisis to do that reimagining. We should be doing it all the time and taking bold actions all the time. And so I think that's the importance of forward thinking for me. It's just a reminder to always kind of question the boundaries of the boxes that we're in, and to kind of push forward and to build new alliances and connections.
Thank you so much, Professor Ralph, for being with us both in October and now.
Thank you.
Up next, we'll talk with two professors who are new to Forward Fest and see how their work intersects with topics that have come up during a year of forward thinking. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. I'm pleased to be joined now by Gregory, who is a professor of religion as well as the chair of the Princeton University Humanities Council. Professor Gregory, in previous Forward Fests, we've heard from a number of your colleagues about their specific lens on humanistic inquiry, but we haven't heard from anyone with a religion or ethics perspective. Can you tell us a little bit about the things in this momentous year that you've been working on and thinking about?
Sure, it's good to be here. So as you mentioned, I'm an ethicist in a religion department. Now, most of my colleagues in Princeton's religion department are historians and very learned and work on various traditions in the past. But Princeton has always had a strong, what we would call normative or constructive wing in a religion department as well. So I have colleagues who are philosophers and ethicists like myself who try to be sensitive to the historical context of different religious traditions and their impact on culture and politics and society and all sorts of things, but to also kind of think with these traditions. So in my own work, I've often tried to think mostly with Jewish and Christian traditions, pre-modern traditions, but put them in conversation with debates about contemporary issues. So sometimes that's about very concrete issues in bioethics or the ethics of war or technologies, or even this year thinking about responses to pandemics. But I've written about the role of religion in public life, and in particular thinking with a 5th century North African bishop, Saint Augustine of Hippo, and what he had to say about all sorts of things, the inner life, the nature of politics, and the relationship between charity and justice, and how we think about what is demanded of us and those things that perhaps are good to do but not required of us to do. So those are in some ways, enduring questions. But the current project I've been thinking about is in particular the way Augustine thought about our different relationships and what we owe strangers in particular. And I thought I was going to write a short book on the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is one of these stories that finds its way into contemporary secular philosophy and actual real politics. People invoke it when debating immigration or things like that. And it turns out it wasn't a very popular story in early Christianity, but it has become a kind of what's the right word? A very attractive parable for today, particularly for encouraging us to care for people who are not like us, and to kind of transcend boundaries, whether those are of race or religion or geography. And it's been invoked in different ways. Famously, Henry Luce, in this essay he wrote, The American Century, called upon Americans to be good Samaritans to the world, to intervene in World War II. And one of his other examples was to subsidize American agriculture to feed the world. Well, it turns out critics now think that that actually did more harm than good. And there's debates about what it means to be a good Samaritan. There's often unintended consequences. And also in the ancient world, it was pretty clear maybe who was in your inner circle, which was an image that the ancient Stoics used, Augustine picked up, was picked up by Emerson, it's picked up by my colleague Peter Singer. And to think about the moral life as a series of concentric circles, and that we have stronger duties perhaps to those close to us, and then it goes outward. The problem is, I think in this age of globalization, those circles have been scrambled, and we have all sorts of complex relationships with people around the world. And in particular, while I once kind of had this smaller project, I've gotten interested in part about how this story bears upon our world, but also questions about nationalism and what role our national identity should have in the way we think about our moral life and the bonds of citizenship that we have. And does that mean we owe more to fellow Americans than we might to distant strangers? At the same time, this story propelled interest in a lot of philanthropy and humanitarian aid around the world. And some of my colleagues at Princeton, I've learned a lot from people who actually sort of know facts and development economists and anthropologists, and they've called into question a lot of the kind of world of philanthropy and humanitarianism that's often celebrated. But now there's kind of questions both about effectiveness, but also about the kind of hierarchies of power that it creates. So the book I'm looking at, or the book I've been thinking about this year, gets at these questions about what do we owe strangers? How does globalization impact things? And how does this help us perhaps think about a world where nations matter less and less, but they also matter more and more? So questions about national identity and the ethics of humanitarianism, all of which have been sort of in the news all the time. And I'm sort of used to that in the sense that I teach courses on a lot of contemporary issues, but I've become more and more convinced that moving forward, it's always good as a humanist to think with the past, recognizing how different it was, but also that we're not alone with our thoughts and that these traditions have a big impact on how people have thought about things and how our world has been shaped. And so they might help us think moving forward as well.
Right, and moving forward has certainly been a theme for us this year. And I'm personally thinking about my generation of students who are being called to service and activism more and more. And additionally, how Princeton has prepared us to think critically and apply these core concepts of ethics and philosophy to our real lives as citizens of the world.
Many people say that we need the humanities now more than ever, as we've thought about in this year of kind of alienation and often loneliness, as well as a desire for connection to the world. And we've seen in the debates we are having both in the United States and around the world that humanists have much to contribute, not just to kind of apply the humanities, but that the questions that face us are very much humanistic ones.
Most definitely. Professor Gregory, it was great to have you here. Thank you so much. And we're looking forward to having you join those who registered for the live conversation a little bit later.
Thanks so much for this conversation.
After this brief break, we will be back with Professor Allison Carruth, who bridges humanistic and scientific inquiry to help us consider how to approach pressing environmental problems and imagine more just and livable futures. But first, we wanted to share an example of how the arts also provide an approach for talking about big ideas. Z. Crystal Yu, class of 2024, created the dance piece entitled Becoming Wren, which was included in the art showcase that was a part of the December Forward Fest. We are happy to rebroadcast it for you now.
With 1,000 paper cranes, with 1,000 paper cranes, with nights of missed family dinners, without a mother's embrace for 8 years, without a father's for 17. With a one-bedroom apartment in Chinatown, with a radiator in the back corner, at times sprinkling hot water against the white tainted walls. The rusted stovetop, the broken doorknob, without invites to my home because of the foreseen embarrassment and unwarranted pity. Mapo tofu, wobbly silken cubes awash in a numbing and spicy pool of fiery mala, without the tangy texture because I've been away too long and my tongue turned gray. With blisters from mucking bars, with cuts from falling on turf, with my first hello and thank you butchered, with elementary school kids jeering, with my apology rejected when I accidentally bumped into some 5th grade girls, with a response, sorry isn't good enough. With a sustained mentality that nothing will be enough. With doubts and insecurities, with time passing by and everyone moving through, without fear, without alarm, even when my mom stops coming home from work, or when I walk alone the streets of Times Square, without restriction when I dig my toes into the concrete floor and wrap my arms around my torso, with movement and music, with heavy breaths and muffled babbles, with one voice reminding me to smile through each day, with learning to be human, 1,000 paper cranes and 1,000 scars.
We're glad to have with us now Allison Carruth, who has recently joined the Princeton faculty with a joint appointment in the program of American Studies and the High Meadows Environmental Institute. Welcome.
Thank you for having me here.
Professor Carruth, we just heard from Gregory about how humanistic inquiry allows us to bring our experience of who we are as humans to any number of really big, complex questions, whether technical or not. Your research currently centers on science, communication, and environmental narratives and the evolving relationships between technology and ecology. Can you tell us a little bit about how your areas of interest bridge both technical, scientific fields and the humanities?
Yes, I'd be happy to reflect on those connections. I think I would start with a broader context by saying that over my career, I've been heartened by how many scientists, people who work in science advocacy and science policy or work across kind of the boundary between public policy and community organizing, let's say, in the sciences, how much increasingly those groups have actually been reaching out to both the humanities and the arts and actually thinking in ways that I find really kindred to the way I and colleagues think about these questions of values, storytelling, art and the imagination, realizing that the problems that we're tackling are so very complex in the 21st century that to approach them through a strictly technical or data-driven or legal lens is insufficient. Those are crucial, absolutely crucial, but insufficient. Philosophers have a concept of the wicked problem, and I think most of the problems we confront in the 21st century qualify from, anthropogenic climate change to the sort of growing likelihood of pandemics along the lines that we've all experienced around the world and are continuing to experience with COVID-19, to many others, social and income inequality, and we could go on. And these wicked problems, they require all kinds of knowledge, right, and all kinds of expertise to really solve. But we also have to reimagine what counts as the solution. Right. And that's where I think the humanities can be particularly vital. And so in my own area, which has to do, well, historically, over the last 15 years, most of my research has focused on the cultural and social aspects of food system challenges. Both historically, thinking about the sort of long 20th century United States, what's gone on with food and agriculture, and in the very recent present. Over the last few years, I've shifted my focus somewhat to think about other environmental issues related to urban sustainability and environmental justice, related to climate change and all of its dimensions. And what's been consistent in that is my really strongly held conviction that writers and artists and other people who work in the imagination as their primary realm, right, that they have a lot to teach us about these kinds of challenges. And in fact, not just in terms of helping us understand them through a creative lens, but actually really think in very practical ways sometimes about like what's at stake in terms of how these challenges affect different kinds of communities, how they have in the past, what's at stake in actually presenting certain kinds of solutions that often have really big ramifications for how we live day-to-day life in different parts of the world or in different cultural contexts.
Yes, and one of the things that Professor Gregory actually just said was that these broader investigations of how we're all doing what we're doing in the world in our own place impacts others around the globe. That's so key to environmental questions. But the way he posited it, he said that nations now matter less and less and more simultaneously. Your position here at Princeton is both with the Meadows Environmental Institute and within American Studies. Can you talk a little bit about his thesis that really plays out in your work?
I mean, first, just to say very briefly, this field of mine, American Studies, that it has from its beginnings been a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary field. There has always been within the field, and increasingly over the last, let's say, 10 or 15 years, a productive tension between a focus on the United States as a nation state in all of its cultural and social complexity, past, present, and future, and the Americas, right, as a much larger transnational and hemispheric, right, place in the world. And I think that is really crucial that American Studies sees both the nation as its center of gravity intellectually and this, this even more diverse and complex hemisphere. And at the same time, in my own work on environmental questions, and particularly my work that's been related to food systems and food cultures, I think scales smaller than the nation are vital, and maybe more so than ever. And not just the local. I have been thinking a lot about the crucial importance of the region, which sometimes crosses, in fact, often crosses national borders, right? A region like the Sonoran Desert, right? Or the Gulf Coast. And so on, right? So I think that these questions of how we think about environmental challenges when we're bringing the knowledge of the humanities into those questions, that the nation remains very important and quite powerful, but it is, again, I'll use the term insufficient, right, as our lens. Yeah, I think that's interesting to think about the way nations are both waning and waxing in their importance in the 21st century. I mean, on the one hand, we see the way that nation states, right, can be can be hugely influential of what can and can't happen in terms of environmental change or environmental policy making. At the same time that there can be incredible innovation and activism happening both at the global and regional levels, pushing against that sort of structure of the nation state.
Well, one of the things that you're helping Princeton think forward and move forward is your plan to launch an environmental media lab. I was wondering if, in talking about this lab, you could also tell us more generally how you think of story as being so important in getting things not only communicated, but accomplished.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I mean, I have been thinking about storytelling for my entire intellectual life, and probably far longer than that when I think about what drew me to the work I do now. And I'll just say it's, one of the things that has been most exciting to me about the opportunity to join the faculty at Princeton is the support for launching an environmental media, art, and storytelling lab. And I think what I would say about story is, first of all, I take a really capacious approach to even thinking about what counts as storytelling. And so in particular, I really think about, on the one hand, what can the most out there, experimental, far-flung, fictional stories, right, provoke for both communicating the contours of environmental science, environmental crisis, environmental change, and also how can they, in fact, sort of nudge us, or maybe more than nudge us, to thinking differently about how we tackle these problems, right? To some extent, I think so we can think about science fiction here, but we can also think about forms of storytelling that I don't think are often associated with environmental issues, like comedy, right? And here, I mean, I think what we need to understand, on the one hand, there is reasons to feel despair. There's reasons to be concerned that certain tipping points have already been, sort of passed, and that there's a certain degree of disturbance and change, both ecological and social, that we are already living through, and that some communities in some parts of the world much more so than others, right, related in particular to climate change. And so if that's the case, if we're already in this change, right, that is also, as a lot of activists put it, an emergency, well, how can we look to forms of storytelling on the one hand that are thinking about that level of change in the future, right, and different models for how societies adapt, and how technical solutions interface with, right, lived cultural experiences of those solutions. But also, what happens if we turn to comedy and its resources for approaching some of the most, difficult parts of the human experience with this thing we call humor? Is that also a resource for us? So on the one hand, I think about these arts of storytelling as a resource, as a toolkit, right? But I also think about storytelling where it actually isn't often considered as being active, right, in a policy white paper, right? And with many of my other colleagues who work on sort of science and storytelling, or science and narrative, I have learned from them and had really good conversations with them that we should think about storytelling as being present already in the sciences and in engineering, right? There are narratives that are passed down in these different kinds of communities of experts. And then there are those sort of scientific paradigm shifts, right, that are putting a new narrative forward, or a new story forward. Global warming itself was one of those, right? It was a fundamentally new story about the planet and our impact, right? And it's understandable why there can be everything from skepticism to sort of deliberate denialism when that new story, right, so challenges the prior story about human progress and industrialism.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. And we look forward to getting a chance to have some of our attendees speak with you further in conversation later.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this is a pleasure.
And before we wrap up this Forward Fest program, we wanted to make you aware of a new 9-part video series produced by Princeton University's Office of Communications. The Forward Thinkers series caps off a year of forward thinking through an exploration of bleeding edge ideas that are inspiring faculty across a variety of fields. A new video in the series is published each week. For now, let's take a look.
We have this pretty huge questions. We want to know how the universe began.
It's a great adventure to try to figure out what life is.
The really big remaining question in my field is how the immune system works.
There are all these classicists from the 19th and early 20th centuries who are African American. Why aren't they studied?
Climate change has been accelerating, and it's going to get worse unless we do something now.
Diseases, for example, Alzheimer's.
The question of looted art is global.
There are entire classes of problems that we've just given up as impossible that suddenly might be things that can be solved.
The opportunities for bettering humanity are limitless.
And I said, oh my God, this is the topic we need to work on.
This is my turf.
It might be something that would lead to an entire paradigm shift in our understanding of physics.
I think what's going to happen will have an impact on every one of our lives.
It sounds impossible, but we've done this in the lab.
I'm a forward thinker.
I'm a forward thinker.
And I'm a forward thinker.
Some of those questions gave me chills. I can't wait to binge the whole series later. But right now, I want to close this Forward Fest with a huge thank you for your engagement and participation. For those who RSVP'd previously for the private Zoom session with Professors Carruth and Gregory, you may now follow the link you received in your email to be connected to the live conversation. For those who have simply enjoyed listening to today's Forward Thinkers and perhaps those from previous Forward Fests, I hope that you have enjoyed getting exposure to new ideas, diving more deeply into concepts you may already have been considering, and finding ways to connect to Princeton's interdisciplinary work. May your days ahead be full of health, adventure, and of course, more forward thinking.